What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of all the featured undercard bouts that was on the Zhilei Zhang versus Deontay Wilder fight. This fight card was titled 5v5 because we saw Eddie Hearns and Matchroom and their five fighters take on Frank Warren and Queensberry's five fighters. And I thought that was a very cool concept, a very creative concept that we haven't seen from the sport of boxing. And I gotta give credit to all the promoters that was involved in this card happening, as well as Turkey Aldesh. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this man's name correct, but y'all know who I'm talking about. This man has been responsible for hosting all the fights in Saudi Arabia, and that's been considered to be major and broadcasted on the zone. He's been making an impact in professional boxing as of recently, and he's worked closely with Eddie Hearns and Frank Warren and Bob Arum as well. And also he's been making waves in America as of recent, because y'all know that Terrence Crawford will be working with this man for his next upcoming fight in August, when he'll be making his debut fight at super welterweight versus Israel Madrimov for the world title at super welterweight in August. And this guy, he's making major moves, and he's been putting on the most thrilling, entertaining bouts in the sport of boxing. I can confidently say. I thought I'd throw that opinion out there. And now let's get to the reviewing part of all the fights that I'm going to be giving y'all my post-fight thoughts on. And first fight I'll be giving y'all my thoughts on was for the WBA featherweight title. Raymond Ford, in his first defense of his WBA featherweight title, he took on Nick Ball. And this was one of the best fights that I've seen thus far for this year. And it was very competitive. I personally, at this fight, scored a draw, 6 rounds apiece, 114 and 114. The official judges had this fight scored a split decision, with Nick Ball getting the edge. He became the new WBA featherweight champion. All 3 judges had this fight scored 115 to 113. One judge had it in favor of Ford, while the other 2 had it in favor of Ball. And it was a hard-fought victory, and I would not mind seeing another fight with Ford and Ball competing for the WBA featherweight title, because of how fierce and competitive and close this fight was. And it was very active. The pace was good. Good back and forth action we saw out of these 2 fighters. Their work rate was high, and this was a definite fan-friendly style of a fight. And we saw a fight like this produced from both of these fighters' previous fights before they fought. We saw a competitive bout with Ford and Otave Kolmatov and a dramatic end, and that's how Ford had became the WBA featherweight champion in defeating Kolmatov in a very competitive, fierce fight. And Nick Ball fought who is considered to be the best featherweight in the featherweight division, a long-time champion, and that was for the WBC featherweight title, which Ray Vargas still holds to this day. And that fight ended in a split draw, and where many people had considered where Nick Ball should have walked away the winner. And this was Raymond Ford's first defense, but this was a second shot for Nick Ball at trying to become the champion at featherweight. And he was successful versus Raymond Ford this past Saturday. And to sum up what happened in the fight, I had the earlier rounds in favor of Ball. Other than the first 2 rounds, where both fighters, even though they started out the fight fast from the sound of the bell all the way to the end, but the first 2 rounds, as per usual, this is how it normally goes in the sport of boxing, where both fighters are trying to warm up and loosen up and figure each other out, and that's what we saw. And Nick Ball, once he got into his groove, he started to push the pace, and that was overwhelming for Raymond Ford, and it was looking like too much to handle for Ford with the volume and the constant pressure that Ball was bringing his way, and Ball was able to back Ford up, and Ford didn't have a counter attack for Ball's attacks. And Ford was throwing the more accurate shots, but it didn't have the same power as Ball. There was a power difference with Ball's punches being more effective and more powerful than Ford's shots. And Ford, because of that, wasn't able to stop Ball at his track. And Ball was able to back up Ford, pressure him towards the corner and the ropes. And you could tell the difference in the thud and the shots, that Ball's punches was more powerful and more effective and hurting Ford more than Ford's shots was hurting Ball. And Ford showed throughout the fight that he was the more agile, more faster fighter with better movement and better technical skills. And he puts his punches and places his punches better than Ball, but that wasn't enough to get Ball off of him. It wasn't until the latter rounds, after the 7th round, is when the momentum of the fight turned around in the favor of Ford. Ford was able to land a straight left hand that landed flush on the face of Ball, and that was able to get Ball off of Ford. And then Ford was able to go to work sufficiently on Ball and continue to accurately place his shots. And I was impressed with Ford's ability to level change from going upstairs and downstairs, and his accurate combination and his well timing and his adaptation were impressive factors that he was able to display later on in the fight. And Ford's in-ring IQ was displayed very well after the 7th round in the fight. His ability to adapt, because when Ford was able to figure out the rhythm of Ball's offense, that's when Ford was able to go to work better than he was in the earlier rounds. And he was doing much more effective damage with his shots than in the beginning of the fight. And Ball, his nose got busted from that straight left of Raymond Ford, and that gained respect from Ball to ease off from Ford and take a break from that relentless ongoing pressure of a attack that Ball was bringing his way, that Ford was finding trouble with. And credit to Ball, because he didn't give up. He was resilient. He showed fortitude. He showed determination by marching forward still and coming on with that pressure that was still effective and still able to have Ford on retreat mode. And Ford, he found a way to find more power versus the more energetic Ball, and found the ability to neutralize that high volume pace style of a fight that Ball was fighting him against by putting his foot down and turning up his offense. And that was effective counter from Raymond Ford. And from, as I said, the sound of the bell to the end of the fight, they brought their best. And as I had said, I personally had this fight a draw, and I would definitely I definitely wouldn't mind seeing another fight with these two fighters, and I'm sure that the fans that spectated this fight won't mind seeing another fight with these two fighters. And this was definitely a title caliber of a fight that we saw produced out of these two fighters. And how the featherweight division is looking right now, we saw Brandon Figueroa pick up yet another impressive victory in his most recent fight on the undercard to the Canelo Alvarez versus Jamie Munguia fight. And he's the current interim WBC featherweight champion. That means he's the mandatory challenger for Ray Vargas, who's the legitimate WBC featherweight champion. And I don't know what the promotional deal is with Ray Vargas, because his last fight wasn't aired on PBC. In fact, it was aired on the Zone, and he had his last fight in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know if he's with another promotion and not PBC, which is where we're used to seeing Ray Vargas fight at and have his fights promoted by. So I don't know how likely that fight is going to be with Vargas and Figueroa. And if that fight is next, which it should be, because according to the WBC rankings, and the WBC has been criticized in the past about them not really keeping up to date with their mandatory challengers and them making fixated belts such as all these other belts that's not the legitimate titles, such as pearl belts, emerald belts, and all different kind of titles that they made up out of the blue for big money fights that weren't their real champions. And other title organizations are more strict when it comes to their policies and their champions fighting their number one ranked contenders. We gotta see if the WBC is gonna be strict with their policy and have that fight be made next, because I believe that is the most marquee fight that the featherweight division can produce as of right now. And the other most intriguing fight that we could see next would be a title unification bout between the IBF and WBO featherweight champion Luis Alberto Lopez, who by many people's considerations is the best featherweight in the featherweight division. It's a toss-up between Ray Vargas and Luis Alberto Lopez. Luis Alberto Lopez is on a current win streak. I believe he's on like a 7-fight win streak. And I want to see a fight versus Luis Alberto Lopez taking on the WBO featherweight champion Rafael Espinoza, who was able to pull off the biggest upset, or at least one of the biggest upsets of last year, when he defeated Robeisy Ramirez for the WBO featherweight title. And that would be a easy in-house fight to make happen, because both Lopez and Espinoza are both promoted by Top Rank. And if that fight doesn't happen, we know Robeisy Ramirez, who fights amongst the top contenders at featherweight, with him being a former champion at that division. He got a fight coming up soon, and depending on how that fight goes, Robeisy Ramirez can catapult himself to a title shot, depending on how impressive his performance is. And he's also promoted by Top Rank. And that was one of the best fights of last year that we saw with Espinoza and Ramirez. And I wouldn't mind seeing another fight with Espinoza and Ramirez. And I'm quite sure the fans who saw that fight wants to see a rematch with Espinoza and Ramirez as well. And then there's Josh Warrington, who's been a top name amongst the top of the featherweights for a while, and he's promoted by Matchroom. And we know that Raymond Ford signed with Matchroom as well. And if they're trying to decide on who gets to fight Nick Ball next for the WBA featherweight title, and Nick Ball being promoted by Queensberry, and Queensberry being very flexible with working with Matchroom, we can see if there's that in-house fight with Ford and Warrington, the winner of that fight can challenge for the WBA featherweight title versus Nick Ball, and that's if that immediate rematch doesn't happen with Ball and Ford. And then there's also Mauricio Lara, who's been a top name amongst the top of the featherweights, him being a former champion as well. And he's in the mix of being in line for a title shot for any of the titles in the featherweight division. And then there is Otabe Komatov as well. And then there is the former super bantamweight champion, and his only defeat came from Stephen Fulton, and that's how he lost that WBO super bantamweight title. He's a former super bantamweight champion, and he's been collecting wins ever since he moved up to featherweight. Angelo Leo, he's ranked high when it comes to the WBA featherweight ranking, and then the number one ranked WBA featherweight contender is Mirko Coelho, and then there's a undefeated Japanese fighter. He only had 5 fights, but he's still ranked high according to the WBA featherweight rankings, Hayato Susumi. And then there's also Ruben Villa, Bruce Carrington, Yoel Gonzalez, Tomoki Komita, Nathaniel Collins, and Carlos Castillo, just to mention a few top contenders competing at the top of the featherweights. Moving on to the next fight. I'll be giving y'all my thoughts on Dmitry Bivol's successful defense of his WBA light heavyweight title versus Malik Zinad. Malik Zinad, I haven't heard much from him, but he is a Libyan fighter, I believe, undefeated prior to this fight. Dmitry Bivol defeated Zinad via 6th round TKO, and this was a replacement opponent for what was originally scheduled to be the main event for this fight card. It was supposed to be a undisputed light heavyweight title bout, which all fans was looking forward to, between Bivol and Arthur Beterbiev, who's the current unified light heavyweight champion for all the titles at light heavyweight. But unfortunately, Arthur Beterbiev had to pull out of that fight, postponing that undisputed light heavyweight title bout between the two, because he has suffered an injury during the training camp in preparation for this fight. And that's not a good look for Arthur Beterbiev, especially with the age that Arthur Beterbiev is at. I believe he's in his late 30s, if not, he's already 40 or over the age of 40. I'm not quite sure when it comes to his exact age, but I know he's about that age. And Dmitry Bivol is younger than him, and he is in better physical shape, even though we've seen Arthur Beterbiev in good shape. I'm not saying Beterbiev is in bad shape, but for him to get an injury during training camp in preparation for both Bivol and Beterbiev's biggest fight of their professional boxing career is not a good look. And we've seen Beterbiev get wounded badly before fighting Bivol, which is going to be his toughest challenge, as well. It's going to be the toughest challenge for Bivol's professional boxing career as well. And with all due respect to Malik Zinad, this was more of a warm-up fight, a showcase, a display of fight for Dmitry Bivol. Dmitry Bivol has been a household name amongst the elites in boxing. Well, he should have been considered a elite fighter before he defeated the cash cow of the sport, Canelo Alvarez. And Bivol was a champion before fighting Canelo, but he didn't have the recognition that he holds today after defeating Canelo Alvarez. And then he went on to defeat Gilberto Ramirez, who is another veteran. And Gilberto Ramirez has built himself quite a reputation. And Bivol was able to dominate Ramirez and get a victory in yet another successful title defense of his WBA light heavyweight title. And then he took like a year off, and then in his last fight he was able to capture the IBO light heavyweight title versus Lyndon Arthur in his comeback bout after that year-long layoff. And then he fought Malik Zinad and he was able to knock him out. And Bivol hasn't scored a knockout in, I believe, a few years from what the commentators were saying. And this was, as I had said, to keep Bivol busy and to keep himself active and not to take that long layoff like he did the previous year. And Bivol, he looked more aggressive in this fight. He looked more like a killer in this fight. And he was dominant throughout all 6 rounds of the fight. And he was landing flush, accurate. He was able to display his more aggressive side in this fight and display his power as well. He landed some devastating straight rights, left hooks, and it was overwhelming for Zinad. And those combination of punches got to Zinad, and Bivol was able to land a straight right hand, and he followed that up after combinations and flurries of punches, and that knocked out Malik Zinad. And this is a good look for Bivol because not only does he stay active in preparation for that big fight coming up for the undisputed light heavyweight title, and I saw through the surfaces that they are not gonna cancel this fight with Bivol and Beterbiev. They've only postponed it, and from what I've heard, that they're gonna have this fight happen by later this year. And speaking for Beterbiev's sake, hopefully he recovers fully, and that way he can prepare himself properly for that undisputed title fight coming up later this year. And he's healthy and he has a good training camp. That way there is no excuses for whatever happens. And he's obviously gonna have to prepare to try and win this fight to get all the straps at light heavyweight. And that's all I got to say as far as my post-fight thoughts go for this fight. Anyways, moving on to the next fight. Let's talk about the Daniel Dubois versus Filip Hrgovic fight. Now, this fight was an upset because I was expecting Hrgovic to win this fight because Daniel Dubois is a fighter that is amongst the top of the heavyweights, but if you were undefeated like Hrgovic was prior to this fight, and before I give y'all what had happened in this fight, I'll tell y'all the results. Surprisingly, Daniel Dubois was able to pull off the upset and get a 8th round TKO stoppage win over on Hrgovic. And that was due to a cut that was suffered under the eyebrow of Hrgovic. The doctors took a look at the cut of Hrgovic, and decided that it wouldn't be safe for Hrgovic to continue to fight, and his corner and the referee agreed to it, hence what led to the TKO win for Daniel Dubois. And this is a good look for Dubois, because I say this is Dubois' most impressive victory in his career. And how the fight went, this was a slugfest. This was what fans expect and are used to seeing from heavyweight boxing. From the sound of the bell to the end of the fight, both fighters looked like they were trying to see who can land the heavier blows, and Daniel Dubois was landing the more significant, heavier blows in this fight. And Hrgovic, he couldn't really keep Dubois off of him and box the way how he wanted to. Dubois, by the way how he looked in this fight, he was in tremendous shape, and he was out muscling Hrgovic and fighting his way in and closing that gap between him and Hrgovic, and walking through, better yet, punching through the shots of Hrgovic. And Dubois' key punch in this fight was that stiff jab of his, and that was really an effective blow to Hrgovic, and as well as Dubois' uppercut and his straight right hand as well. And Hrgovic, his best punch was his straight backhand as well, but that wasn't enough to keep Dubois off of him. And Dubois was like a pit bull off his leash, and Dubois kept coming forward and was able to press back Hrgovic, and as I said, was landing the more heavier, thudding, effective shots. And they were landing, as I said, significant blows to each other, but Dubois got the better of the exchanges, and both showed that they were very chinny, they were durable, and we did see that Hrgovic didn't hit the canvas. Dubois wasn't able to drop Hrgovic. That goes to show the durability of both fighters, because both fighters was throwing their best, but neither one of them could drop each other. It was because of the bleeding that was coming out of Hrgovic. That's what led to the stoppage, and it didn't come from a clash of heads. That was caused by accumulation of punches from Dubois. That's what led to the cut that was on Hrgovic's, I believe, his right eye, that was bleeding out from under his right eyebrow. It could have been the left, I'm not quite sure, but it was severe enough for the doctor to step in there and tell the referee to suggest to stop the bout, which is what happened. And that's how Dubois got the win. And Dubois is rumored to be the next opponent for Anthony Joshua, who is scheduled to fight in September. And they're targeting the Wembley Stadium in London for that fight to happen. It would be an all UK affair out there in England, both fighters being based out of the UK. And Anthony Joshua, other than Tyson Fury, is the biggest name out there in English heavyweight boxing, and Daniel Dubois has been a household name for British boxing as well. And that all British affair, and British boxing fans having much more local support and much more enthusiasm for their local fighters when compared to America, because you look at the attendance for local fights out there, they always have a good crowd record, and that's why they can have a successful event at a Wembley Stadium for a non-title bout such as a Joshua versus Dubois. And another fight that would be good if that Joshua-Dubois fight doesn't happen, because it'd only be a 3-month break from Dubois' hard-fought victory versus Hrgovic, who has also been rumored to fight Anthony Joshua. And now that can be on delay because Dubois overtook his place by defeating him this past Saturday. If Joshua and Dubois doesn't happen in September when Joshua is due to fight, then Zhilei Zhang could fight Daniel Dubois, and Zhilei Zhang was on the main event for this card, and Zhilei Zhang was able to knock out Deontay Wilder for the main event of that night, and that fight would be a slugfest as well between two big heavyweights and two big heavyweight punchers, and they fought on the same night. That's why, time-wise speaking, that fight is more better health-wise speaking as well for both Zhilei Zhang and Daniel Dubois, who was able to TKO both of their opponents that night. And that fight, stylistically speaking, would be a good fight as well. And as far as who Anthony Joshua can fight next, Anthony Joshua can fight anybody, and it would be a successful turnout of an event, especially if he fights in the UK, because whenever he fights in England, it's always a sellout crowd because he's been a big draw out there, and him being a former heavyweight champion doesn't hurt that fact either. And that is what I gotta say as far as my post-fight thoughts go for all the fights that happened on the 5 versus 5 card of Queensberry versus Matchroom. And it was a night for Queensberry because 4 out of those 5 fights, Queensberry fighters defeated Matchroom fighters. And I forgot another fight factor that I saw from the Dubois Hrgovic fight as well as the Ball Ford fight. Both fighters, I'm talking about Ball and Ford, other than their straight right and straight lefts, the uppercuts were key punches for both Ford and Ball. And as I have said, Ball was a more powerful puncher, but Ford was the more technical, faster, accurate puncher. And Dubois as well, the uppercut was, well, not for Dubois, Hrgovic, the uppercut was working well for him when he would catch Dubois trying to close that gap and coming in, and using that little height advantage that he had over on Dubois. And Dubois' best punch was his straight right, as well as I mentioned before, the jab of his that was able for Dubois to use to punch through and to be a rangefinder for Dubois throughout that fight. And as far as Raymond Ford goes, he couldn't really establish the jab versus Nick Ball because Nick Ball, like the spark plug, the energizer that he is, he couldn't close that gap just with that punch, and Ball wouldn't give him that room to establish that jab for Ford to keep Ball at bay. And I thought I would throw those factors out there that had happened throughout those 2 fights. Anyway, that does it for this video, y'all. Subscribe to this channel for more boxing videos, and like this video, share this video if y'all want. Click the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Any and all things would be appreciated. And I'm out, y'all. Be good. Peace.